Daniel sprinted through the near-empty station. His coat flapped behind him. The announcement echoed, "Last train departing." He had to make it. He couldn't be late. Not for this train. Panting, he skidded to a halt at the platform's edge. The train doors were closing. With a desperate lunge, he squeezed through just before they slammed shut. He'd made it. But something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. The carriage was eerily deserted. Each seat stood empty, shrouded in deepening shadows. The only light came from flickering gas lamps overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow. He tried the door to the next carriage. Locked. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. This wasn't his usual train. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something unnameable and ancient. He was trapped. He tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps he'd boarded the wrong train in his haste. Yes, that was it. He'd explained the situation to the conductor, get off at the next stop. A simple mistake. He walked towards the front of the carriage, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The windows, usually clear, were now grimy, impossible to see through. The familiar cityscape had been replaced by an unending darkness. Reaching the driver's cabin, he hesitated. A strange humming emanated from within, a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate in his bones. He knocked tentatively. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a figure that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. The conductor stood framed in the doorway, his eyes two black pits, in a face that seemed both ancient and utterly devoid of life. The conductor's uniform was pristine but threadbare, as if from a forgotten era. His smile, if it could be called that, was a gash of white against deathly pale skin. He spoke, his voice a dry rasp. "Ticket, please." Daniel fumbled for his wallet, his usual confidence replaced by a growing unease. I seem to have boarded the wrong train," he stammered. "Could you please let me off at the next stop?" The conductor's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. "There are no stops on this line, sir, not anymore." His eyes, cold and lifeless, bored into Daniel as if seeing right through him. Panic welled up inside Daniel. He stumbled back, wanting nothing more than to flee, to escape the confines of the train. But the door to the next carriage remained locked, a steel barrier to his terror. He pressed his face against the grimy window, desperate for a glimpse of something familiar, something reassuring. But the darkness outside was absolute, broken only by fleeting glimpses of impossible landscapes, twisted trees with branches like grasping claws whipped past. Distant mountains, their peaks scraping the sky, seemed to writhe and shift like living creatures. This was not the world he knew. Daniel sank onto a seat, his mind reeling. The rhythmic chugging of the train, once a comforting sound, now echoed the frantic beating of his heart. He felt adrift, unmoored from reality. He was trapped on this spectral train, hurtling through a nightmarish world, with a conductor who seemed more spectre than man. Despair threatened to engulf him. Section 5. A cry in the void. A sound pierced the oppressive silence, a muffled sob coming from somewhere deeper within the train. He wasn't alone. Hope flickered, a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness. He pushed himself up, following the sound. It led him through carriage after carriage, each one as empty and desolate as the last. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate. He found the source in the last carriage. A young woman sat huddled in a corner, her face buried in her hands. She was dressed in a simple cotton dress, her hair a tangled mess. Relief washed over Daniel. Someone else, someone real. He wouldn't face this nightmare alone. "Hello?" he ventured, his voice hesitant. "Are you all right?" Section 6. Whispers from Forgotten Luggage. The woman looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, her face streaked with tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a strangled gasp. She pointed to a worn leather suitcase at her feet. He crouched down, curiosity overriding his fear. The suitcase was old, its leather cracked and faded. He unlatched it, revealing a jumble of clothes, yellowed photographs, and a child's doll, its porcelain face cracked. As he touched the doll, a wave of icy cold washed over him. Images flooded his mind, vivid and terrifying. He saw a young family, laughing and happy, boarding this very train. Then darkness, their joy replaced by terror. The images faded, leaving behind a bone-chilling certainty. These weren't just belongings, they were remnants, echoes of lives lost, trapped within the train's spectral embrace. Section 7. The Revelation. Daniel looked up at the young woman, his heart heavy with a terrible understanding. You were on that train," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She nodded mutely, tears streaming down her face. She pointed at herself, then at the suitcase, then at the seemingly endless tracks stretching into the darkness. Her meaning was clear. She was trapped, just like the family in the photograph, just like all the souls on this train. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see the conductor standing behind him, his eyes gleaming with an unholy light. "They never learn, do they?" he rasped, his voice like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "Learn what?" Daniel croaked, his throat tight with terror. Section 8. Destination unknown. The conductor leaned in close, his breath cold and fetid against Daniel's ear. "This train," he hissed, "it isn't for the living, it's for those who wander, those who are lost." He gestured around at the empty carriages, his smile widening. They board, hoping for a way home. But this train, it only has one destination. He straightened up, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond Daniel's comprehension. Daniel staggered back, his mind rebelling against the horrifying truth. He was trapped on a ghost train, hurtling towards some unknown abyss, condemned to share the fate of the lost souls around him. The conductor threw back his head and let out a chilling laugh, a sound that echoed through the carriages, a sound that spoke of ages of suffering and despair. Section 9. Alone with the Lost. The young woman huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with terror. She knew. They all knew. This train offered no escape, no salvation, only oblivion. Daniel felt a strange sense of calm descend upon him. He was past fear, past hope. He was adrift in a sea of sorrow, surrounded by the echoes of lives lived and lost. He was one of them now. He sank to his knees, the weight of their collective despair crushing him. The train rattled onwards, its mournful whistle echoing through the endless night. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the inevitable. Section 10. Fading Echoes. The train shuddered to a halt. He opened his eyes. They had arrived. A swirling vortex of energy crackled at the end of the tracks, its colours shifting and changing like an oil slick. It pulsed with a malevolent energy that promised oblivion. The conductor turned to him, his grin a grotesque mockery of a smile. "Welcome," he rasped, "to your final destination." He gestured towards the swirling vortex. Daniel glanced back at the young woman. She was gone. All that remained was the worn leather suitcase, a single heartbreaking reminder of a life cut short. He was alone. He rose to his feet and walked towards the vortex, each step heavy with the weight of his fate. As he crossed the threshold, he cast one last glance back at the fading image of the train, its mournful whistle echoing in his ears, a final chilling farewell.